Once upon a time, in a faraway land, there lived a wealthy merchant. This merchant was successful in every business he undertook. When he bought silk, everyone decided to have a new gown or a new suit of clothes, and so he sold all he had and made money. If he bought spices, everyone acquired a taste for them and purchased all he could provide. He bought banks, and everyone rushed to put their money in them. He owned ships and shops, houses and warehouses, and a little bit of many, many things. The merchant was a very busy man. Because he was so successful, he worked all the time, or perhaps it was the other way around, and he was very popular, as rich and successful people tend to be. Everyone wanted his advice, his help, and his attention. He was invited to make speeches, to christen new ships, and to be guest of honor at any number of banquets. In addition to all his wealth, the merchant had 3 daughters, and all were beautiful and accomplished. The eldest daughter was named Belinda, and she had long golden hair, of which she was very proud. Bella was the second daughter, and her hair was red as fire. Belinda and Bella enjoyed being the daughters of such a rich and powerful man. They loved going to grand parties and spent great sums of money on beautiful dresses and jewels and all the latest fashions in everything, each trying to outdo the other. If the truth be told, Bella and Belinda were a little selfish, thinking most often about themselves. They were proud of their beauty and wealth, and they considered themselves to be better than others who were less fortunate. The youngest daughter had hair as black and shining as a starry night, and she was the loveliest of the 3. Although the most beautiful, she was not vain or proud, and perhaps the unselfishness and kindness of her nature added to her beauty. In any case, beauty she was, and so she was called. Life went along splendidly for the merchant and his daughters. Belinda and Bella were engaged to be married to 2 rich young men. They wore the biggest diamond engagement rings anyone had ever seen, and each planned a wedding which they hoped would be more fabulous and expensive than any before. Though many young men had sought after beauty, she found none of them to her liking. She was content to stay at home with her books and music and her gray cat, Cuthbert. Beauty's sisters thought her mad and made fun of her for disdaining the glittering entertainments they so enjoyed. Then things changed for the merchant. All his great ships filled with treasure were lost at sea, some plundered by pirates, some foundered on rocks and sank, and some disappeared in a great storm. None of the shimmering silks, the rare, delicious spices, or the beautiful carpets came to harbor. His shops and warehouses were empty of goods, for he had nothing to sell. People rushed to take their money out of his banks for fear that they would lose their savings. Suddenly, all the good friends who had wanted his advice and promised eternal friendship discovered that they had never really liked or trusted the merchant after all. They turned their backs on his need and scorned him for a failure. The rich young men wrote polite notes to Bella and Belinda, saying they had been mistaken in their feelings, and asking for their diamond rings back. The merchant had to sell his splendid houses and most of his furniture and books, and the daughters reluctantly had to part with all their jewels and furs. Only Beauty did not complain. At least, she did not complain aloud, because she did not wish to hurt her father's feelings or add to his worries. Taking his daughters, the merchant left the city and all his false friends, and went to live in a small cottage in the forest, the one property he had left. When they arrived at the cottage, Belinda and Bella were horrified and cried aloud at the sight of so humble a dwelling. "We can't possibly live here," cried Belinda. "It's much too small and cramped." "And so old and run down," cried Bella. "Papa, you can't mean to make us live here." The poor merchant tried to reassure his daughters that the house, though small, was snug and warm and would shelter them through the winter. Beauty, hugging Cuthbert's furry warmth to her, looked thoughtfully at the garden. It was not large, and it had been neglected since the last tenant had left, but it was full of flowers of all kinds and colors. All, that is, except for roses. She looked hopefully among all the sweet-smelling flowers growing in the garden, but not a single rose was to be found. Although Beauty was as unused to hard work as the other daughters, she resolutely took up an apron and a broom. Her sisters were even more horrified at doing the work that servants had once done for them. But there was no help for it. All the sweeping and washing and cooking had to be done, and there was no one else to do it. The merchant was sick at heart to see his daughters working so hard, but he was proud of Beauty, for though she worked the hardest, she did not complain. She sang as she worked, with Cuthbert padding along at her heels and lying on her feet at night as she sat by the fire mending. The older daughters were jealous and resentful of Beauty and her good nature, feeling that their father loved her best. To be fair, the merchant tried to make no difference between his children and to treat them all equally. But Beauty was generous and gentle, and never made him feel as if he had failed her. If she sighed for her past life of ease and pleasure, she did it only at night in her dreams. Meanwhile, the merchant made the rounds of other small huts and cottages scattered throughout the countryside. He peddled the small trinkets and odds and ends he had been able to save from his stores of goods, and in this way he made a small but honest living. One day, news came to the little cottage in the forest. A single ship belonging to the merchant had come safely to harbor, and he hastened to make ready for the journey back to the city to reclaim his property. Bella and Belinda danced for joy, thinking that the difficult times were over. His daughters helped him pack, and Belinda and Bella had many requests for jewels and dresses. They asked for so many things that the merchant would have needed a fleet of ships to provide all they needed, or thought they did. Only Beauty asked for nothing. Finally, the merchant asked if there was nothing she wanted. "Only your safe return," she replied. Now Belinda and Bella, who knew they had been greedy and selfish, were angry at Beauty for putting them in such a poor light. Like most people, they did not enjoy facing their own faults. The merchant insisted that Beauty name at least one gift for him to bring back to her. She cast about in her mind for something which would cost him nothing, and finally hit upon the very thing. "A rose," she said. "Bring me a rose, for though I have tried and tried, I cannot get roses to grow in this garden, and you know how much I have always loved them." This modest request only added to Bella and Belinda's jealousy, for they could not believe that Beauty would really be satisfied with such a small gift. The merchant set out, sped on his way by his daughters, with high hopes for a more comfortable future. His hopes were not to be realized, however. When he reached the city, he found that his former partners, pretending to have believed him dead, had claimed and divided all the treasures from his ship. He went to court to regain his property, and after a long, hard struggle, he won his case. The cost of the suit was so high, however, that the only ones who could be said to have gained anything much out of the case were the lawyers, who were very satisfied indeed with their fees. So the merchant turned toward his home in the forest with only a little more than he had when he began his journey. He had managed a small trinket each for Belinda and Bella, but the season for roses was long past, so he had no gift for Beauty. He had been forced to stay in the city for so long that summer had faded, and autumn was also passing away. "And there lies winter, dead ahead," he muttered as he gazed uneasily at the great dark clouds gathering above him. Sure enough, before long the first fine flakes of snow began to fall, at first slowly, then faster and faster, until all the world was one swirling veil of white. His poor horse could not see the trail, and the merchant was so cold he could no longer feel his feet. Seeing a hollow tree, he and the horse crowded in as close as possible. In this way they passed the night together in some warmth, if not in comfort. The next morning came, and though it was no longer snowing, it was still very cold. The weary merchant, hungry and tired, prayed that he would find a hut or cottage soon, and someone to share with him a little food and warmth. Then, among the trees heavy with their burden of snow, he saw a wide, smooth path bordered with orange trees. Now the merchant knew, even with his half-frozen brains, that orange trees in the dead of winter ought not to be covered with oranges. Still less should they have fragrant orange blossom sending its perfume out into the still, frozen woods. Wondering, he led his horse up the drive, expecting any moment to see a great house or palace. And sure enough, as he turned a wide bend in the drive, he saw just ahead such a great house as he had been imagining, larger and more imposing than any he had ever seen before. Surely, he thought, these rich people will have a little bread to spare and a warm place to rest for me. He went first to the stables, and finding a stall filled with clean straw and a manger full of grain, he rubbed his horse down and covered him comfortably with the warm rug which lay at hand. Leaving his faithful friend contentedly munching his long-awaited breakfast, the merchant went out to the courtyard and up the great staircase to the doors. As he approached, he saw that the doors stood open, and he went in, amazed that anyone with such a valuable property would leave the front door unlocked. He was struck by the absolute silence inside, and as he timidly went from room to room, he saw and heard no sign of any living being except himself. If the rooms had been even a little dark, even a little gloomy or mysterious, he probably would have been so terrified by the silent emptiness that he would have run for his life, cold or no cold. But each room was lighted by crystal lamps, each furnished with beautiful furniture polished and shining, each warmed by rich curtains and thick carpets. Everywhere he looked, he saw lovely things, paintings and books and ornaments of every description, everything anyone might be able to imagine for a luxurious life of ease and pleasure. When he came to a small room with a deep chair drawn up before the fire which burned cheerfully in the fireplace, he had no hesitation in sitting down and putting his tired feet up. Before he had time to draw more than one deep breath, he was sound asleep, comfortable and warm for the first time in what seemed like years. When he awoke, the merchant found a table near at hand, set with fine crystal and china, and laden with every delicious food he could remember having tasted in his life. Feeling as if he had not eaten for weeks, the merchant tucked a napkin around his neck and set about cleaning up the table before him. In an astonishingly short time, he had very nearly accomplished his self-appointed task. With a sigh of contentment, he leaned back and closed his eyes. If only his daughters could enjoy a visit to this wonderful palace, how they would laugh and run from room to room, exclaiming over the treasures. How Beauty would cry aloud in delight at the sight of all the books, rooms of them, waiting to be read. Rested and refreshed, he rose and resumed his search, determined to find the owners of all this magnificence and thank them. After hours of looking, however, the merchant had discovered only aching feet and a mind spinning with all the wonders he had seen. Nowhere in the great palace, nor in the beautiful gardens where summer lingered still, was there any sign of host, servant, or guest. He was absolutely alone. Night fell, and the merchant went to a bedchamber which had a fire in the grate, a nightshirt laid out on the big bed, and a variety of cakes, juices, and wines set out for his enjoyment. With a final sigh of absolute contentment, the merchant sank into the pillows and was asleep. The following morning, after a sustaining breakfast, the merchant dressed in the fine clothes laid out for him and went to the stables to fetch his horse. It was time to return home. As he saddled his horse, the old saddle had disappeared and had been replaced by a beautiful new one. He thought about the great palace and its magical hospitality. Finally, he decided that it could not just be chance that had led him to the wonderful place. The generous care he had received meant just one thing. The palace and all it contained was meant for him, waiting for him to come and take up his place there. In a burst of joy, he led his horse out to the wide drive, ready to fetch his daughters to their new home. The sight of roses stopped him. There were thousands of them, the most beautiful red roses he had ever seen, blooming all around the courtyard and gardens. "I can take Beauty her gift after all," he exclaimed, and leaning down he plucked the nearest of the huge, fragrant roses. In an instant it seemed as if the sky had darkened, and his ears were filled with a terrible roaring. Spinning around he beheld a huge beast wrapped in a great black cloak, whose eyes gleamed as red as blood. The beast roared again, pointing a terrible claw at the rose which had fallen from the merchant's nerveless hand. "Thief! Is it not enough that I have provided for your every need, your every comfort? This is how you repay my hospitality, by stealing from me my roses?" The poor merchant was terrified, almost to the point of heart failure, but he forced himself to stand upright and answer the beast. Good sir," he stammered, "I am most truly sorry if I have offended you. I was so overwhelmed by the great generosity you have shown me, I did not imagine that you would mind if I took just one rose home to my daughter Beauty." "The penalty for stealing is death." The merchant fell to his knees then and pleaded with the beast. "Good sir, please spare my life. I am the sole support of my 3 daughters, and if you kill me, they will surely starve." "You have 3 daughters? Yet you took only 1 rose." The merchant dared to rise from his knees and looked up at the beast. He found himself telling the horrible creature all about his losses and his daughters living now in such a poor way in the forest. He told him about the ship and his daughters' requests for presents. "And the youngest, Beauty, would only ask for a rose, for it was midsummer when I left, and who was to know it would be so hard to find such a simple gift?" The beast appeared to think for a time, his great hairy paw rubbing his jaw. "Very well, I will spare your life on one condition. Go home and ask if any one of your daughters will come here in your stead. If one agrees, bring her back to me, and she shall pay the price for you." The merchant was aghast. "I could never allow one of my children to die for me," he cried. "Then I will kill you now, and they will all starve. Go home and ask your daughters. If not one of them will come, then you may return yourself. And do not think that you can hide from me. If you do not come back, I shall come and get you, and it will be worse than anything you can imagine." Then the beast picked up the fallen rose and handed it to the merchant. "Don't forget your rose," he said in a soft, cold voice, infinitely more terrifying than a loud roar. The poor man flung himself on his horse and rode down the drive as if the devil was after him, which is exactly what he did think. In no time at all, the merchant found himself on the hillside overlooking his little house, and with a heavy heart he rode down the path to his door. His daughters all came dancing out to meet him. Bella and Belinda demanded his presence, and Beauty clung to his stirrup, asking if all was well with him. "Alas, my daughters," he cried, "all is very ill indeed." He took out the presents he had brought, a little gold bracelet for Bella and a gold locket for Belinda. Bella and Belinda let it be seen that they were very disappointed with them, but they took them just the same. "And here is your rose, Beauty," he said sadly, "though you never imagined what a sorrow you would bring when you ask for it." He then told his daughters about the beast and his demand. Bella and Belinda were loud in their protests, crying out at Beauty and blaming her for their misfortune. "It's all your fault," cried Bella, stamping her foot. "If you had asked for an ordinary present, none of this would have happened." Belinda snatched the rose from Beauty's hand and crushed it under her foot. "This is what comes from always pretending to be better than others," she cried. Poor Beauty gazed at her father, tears in her eyes. "Dear father," she said gently, "of course I will go to the beast's palace in your place." The merchant cried out at that, shaking his head. "Never, never, my daughter," he said. "I have only come back to say goodbye to you and leave you these few things I managed to save from the ship. If you are careful, the money they will bring will keep you." Belinda and Bella then began to think how they might be rid of Beauty and keep their father at home to provide for them. They were really very selfish girls and thought of nobody but themselves. "I think Beauty should go," said Bella. "It's only fair. She asked for the rose, so she should pay the price for it, instead of you going away and leaving us all to starve." "Yes," said Belinda, "it's true. You cannot abandon your responsibilities to us." In this way, over and over, all night long, the sisters wore the poor merchant down. Finally, he looked at Beauty. "Do you really want to do this terrible thing?" "Father," she replied, "I should never know another happy day if I let you go to your death. And who knows, perhaps the beast is only testing you, and if we go back, he will pardon you." And so the merchant was at last persuaded. Perhaps he saw that life with Bella and Belinda would not be a great deal better for Beauty than her fate at the beast's hands, or paws in this case. After she had said her farewells to her sisters and a last sorrowful pat to Cuthbert, who mewed piteously, the merchant took Beauty up behind him on his horse. Cuthbert tried to run after them, but the merchant resolutely turned away and started out again for the beast's palace. It seemed as if they had no sooner ridden in among the trees than the horses' hoofs turned down the orange blossom drive and the palace came into view. Beauty gasped at the size and splendor of the palace and was too amazed to be frightened. All happened as it had before. The merchant and his youngest daughter entered the palace and went through room after room until they came to the small, comfortable apartment with the fire and the table laden with delicious foods. "Come," Beauty said, "this is hopeful. The beast cannot mean to kill me if he is showing such hospitality." The merchant agreed, keeping his gloomy reflections on being fattened up for the kill to himself. They sat down and made a good meal, enjoying the food and the warmth in spite of their fears. Then there was that same terrible roaring sound, and the beast was before them. At the sight of him, so huge and menacing, his great black cloak billowing around him and his eyes gleaming, Beauty came near to fainting. With desperate courage she faced the beast with her father. "So one of your daughters did agree to come in your stead. I am surprised. You are certain you did not compel her?" "This is my youngest daughter, Beauty," said the merchant. "I brought her because she insisted." "Well, well, so you have courage as well as beauty." Beauty lifted her chin a little and answered with grave courtesy, "You were good to my father and helped him in his need. Through my fault he offended you. It is only right that I should pay the debt you now demand." "Well, indeed." Then he turned to the merchant. "You may remain with your daughter for the night. In the next room you will find traveling trunks and a variety of goods. You may fill the trunks with as much as they will hold and take them home to your other daughters. But at sunrise you must leave." The beast left them, and Beauty and her father went into the room he had indicated. There were the trunks, as he had said, and piled all around on shelves and in cabinets and coffers were every variety of treasure. Beautiful gowns and jewels lay everywhere, and piles of gold and silver, lengths of silk and cloth of gold, feathers and fans and linen and lace, more than even the great 2 chests could possibly hold. As they packed, Beauty tried to be cheerful. "How pleased Bella and Belinda will be to see all this, and I will be glad to know that you are all well provided for." "I would give it all if I could just take you home again tomorrow," said the merchant sadly. "I should never have agreed." So Beauty set about comforting him, pointing out that he had not really had any choice. "Really, it is better that the 3 of you will prosper," she pointed out, "than that we should all starve. And who knows, I may do very well here. I cannot believe he means to kill me." The merchant wished he had her faith, but he said nothing, and they finished their packing. Miraculously, all the goods went into the chests. "Though how we shall carry them I cannot imagine," said Beauty. "The beast arranges everything." replied the merchant sadly. No sooner had the last piece of gold gone into the chests than the sun came up, and it was time for the merchant to leave. Beauty went to the stable with her father, and there they found the merchant's horse saddled and waiting. There were also 2 new horses, each bearing one of the great chests they had filled. Bidding his daughter a sad farewell, the merchant rode out of the courtyard, his eyes filled with bitter tears. With lagging steps, Beauty turned and walked back to the palace stairs, where she stood watching until her father was out of sight. Then she went into the palace. As her father had done before her, she wandered from room to room examining the treasures of the palace, but her heart was heavy, for she did not know if this night was to be her last. She came upon a bedchamber which had clearly been made ready for her. Her little bundle of possessions had been laid on a chest at the foot of the bed. Overcome with fear and grief, she threw herself on the soft bed and wept until she fell asleep. It was late in the evening when she awoke to find the crystal lamps alight and a bath of warm-scented water waiting for her. "One certainly cannot complain about the service," she exclaimed, overcome with longing for a long, hot bath. After soaking away the last of her tiredness, Beauty wrapped herself in the sumptuous velvet robe which lay waiting for her and looked curiously around the room. She discovered the closet and chests were full of the most beautiful clothes imaginable, in all the colors which most became her dark beauty. The dressing table held several large jewel boxes filled to the brim with necklaces, bracelets, rings, and earrings, set with every jewel under the sun. Diamonds and rubies and sapphires, emeralds and topazes and amethysts, pearls and opals and aquamarine, and many others she did not recognize. One lovely golden bracelet spelled out beauty in rubies, and the sight of it lifted her heart, not because it was beautiful, though the workmanship was exquisite, but because surely the beast would not provide her with a roomful of clothes and jewels if he meant to kill her. So it was in a reasonably courageous state of mind that Beauty dressed herself in a gown of white lace embroidered all over with tiny rubies, and the bracelet bearing her name, and went to look for the dining room. She found it with no trouble, for her steps brought her almost immediately to a small dining room with a place set for one. One look at the display of dishes reminded her that she was very hungry, for she had not eaten since the night before. No sooner had she finished her dinner than she heard the roaring sound that came with the beast. There he was, his bulk seeming to darken the lamps as he loomed over her. "Good evening, Beauty. May I join you?" "Please do, beast. Will you not eat something?" she asked, her voice shaking only a little at the mention of eating. At that, the beast seemed to smile a little, if such a fearsome mouthful of sharp teeth could be said to smile. "Thank you, I have dined. You are comfortable? There is something you wish for? You have only to speak it aloud, and it shall be provided instantly." She shook her head. "I can imagine nothing that you have not already given me." He said as softly as possible for a beast, "I desire only to please you. Tomorrow you will find much to amuse you." He stayed by her for an hour, asking about her life and listening to her stories with every appearance of amusement. When the hour was over, he stood up and bowed. "Good night, Beauty. Do not be afraid of anything you may hear in the night. Nothing will harm you so long as you do not leave the palace. That you must never dare to do after dark." "Good night, beast," she responded. With that he left her alone, and so Beauty took up her life in the beast's palace. The next day she explored her new home. Discovering the book, she immediately sank down in a comfortable chair and abandoned herself to the bliss of reading. When she grew tired of that, she found a piano with a large supply of music, and so she whiled away the afternoon playing and singing, a pastime she had missed since coming to the humble forest cottage. A walk in the garden showed her flowers beyond counting, and a lovely little lake where goldfish clustered at the edge. Wishing for bread, she found a basket at her feet, and she laughed at the fish's greediness as she dropped breadcrumbs into the water. This became the pattern of her days. Meals appeared when she was hungry. There was a charming mare in the stables which came when she called, and though she could ride along a variety of trails in the park, the mare would not go outside the invisible boundary which separated the beast's domain from the forest beyond. One afternoon she was feeling especially lonely. She thought about her cat, and a terrible longing came over her. "Cuthbert," she murmured, "if only I had you with me, I should not feel so alone." In an instant she felt a warm purring at her feet, and there she discovered a gray cat looking up with big green eyes. "Oh, darling Cuthbert," she cried, picking him up and caressing his soft fur. "I never thought to see you again." She cried a few happy tears, which dripped onto his head, but Cuthbert did not complain. He had been having a thin time of it with Belinda and Bella. He had no idea of what had happened, but he did know that he would be much better off with Beauty to feed him and pet him and let him sleep on her feet. After that, Beauty's days were happier. She felt much less lonely with Cuthbert following her around, and was only separated from him during dinner when she talked with the Beast. At these times Cuthbert was firmly shut into her room. She had ceased to really fear the Beast by the time several weeks had passed, but felt there was no point in putting added temptation, in the form of Cuthbert, in his way. A few weeks after Cuthbert's arrival, Beauty sat chatting with the Beast at dinner. As usual, he did not eat or drink, but sat watching her with every appearance of pleasure. He asked about her day, and she described some of Cuthbert's antics, at which he chuckled. Actually a bone-chilling sound, but she knew he meant well. When the hour was up, he did not rise as usual. Instead, he bowed and brought out a velvet box from a fold in his cloak. "A small token of my regard." "But, Beast," she protested, "I have so much already." He opened the box and took out a long triple strand of gleaming pearls. "To adorn your beauty," he said softly, and placed them around her throat. It says a great deal about Beauty's courage that she did not flinch from the touch of the great claws at her throat, but she held quite still as he fumbled with the catch. Then, in a voice which sounded terribly sad, "You will have to fasten them yourself." So sad was his voice that she laid her hand over his paw and said softly, "Thank you, Beast. Beauty, will you marry me?" She caught her breath in dismay, taking a step away from him. "No, Beast, I cannot," she said, hoping he would not be enraged. But he merely bowed and told her good night in his usual way, and left her. When she retired to her room, Cuthbert came scolding and complaining across the floor, telling her, as he always did, just how much he resented being shut in. Though his furry face was very expressive, and he switched his plumy tail, she did not laugh as she usually did. Beauty could not forget the intensity in the Beast's eyes when he had asked her to marry him. "And then, Cuthbert," she murmured to the cat, "he looked so very sad when I said no." As she slept with Cuthbert curled up on the foot of her bed, she had a very vivid dream. A beautiful woman stood beside her, and she glimmered in the darkness as if she had a light within. "Beauty," she called in a sad, musical voice, "do not be afraid of appearances. All is not as it seems. If you can believe in that and follow your heart, you shall find true love." Beauty sat up and tried to speak, but as she did so, the beautiful woman vanished. As she settled once more into sleep, she found herself walking in the gardens, but she was not alone. A young man walked with her, and she knew in an instant that he was her true love. It was not his fine clothes, though they were rich beyond compare, or his handsome face, though she had never seen anyone so handsome before, that made her certain. It was the look in his eyes as he gazed at her, and never had she known such kindness, such generosity and tenderness. And as she looked, she knew that his eyes were also the saddest that she had ever seen. Her heart went out to him. Why so sad, she wanted to know. "I am a prisoner," he responded, "and only the most courageous love can set me free. I am waiting for you to find me, Beauty," he said, and with that he disappeared. In her dream, Beauty began to run down the garden paths, calling out for him to wait, to come back. Darkness began to fall, and she knew that she must not be out in the gardens at night. The Beast had warned her never to leave the palace after dark. She cried bitterly as she was forced to go back to the palace without finding the handsome lover who looked so sad and talked of courage. She woke with tears on her cheeks and Cuthbert mewing sadly in her ear. "Oh, Cuthbert," she wept, "he is a prisoner somewhere. How am I to find him?" But Cuthbert was unable to enlighten her. He did, however, lick her cheek with his rough little tongue, and with that she fell back asleep and did not dream again that night. Determined to find the imprisoned lover of her dreams, Beauty explored the palace every day that followed. But though she looked and searched from the cellars to the attics, she never saw a sign of anyone else in the palace. One afternoon, when all other pastimes had become stale, Beauty wandered into a room she had never visited before. It was the size of a ballroom, and all around the walls were great golden doors. Going to the nearest one, Beauty opened the doors, and was astonished to find herself looking into a theater. There was an audience all around, and on the stage a lively play was unfolding. Just inside the door was an empty seat, and she stepped through the doorway and sat down to watch the play. Though she knew she could not go beyond the walls of the box, she felt she was really in the theater, for she could hear the people all about her laughing and applauding as they watched the actors speaking their parts. The time passed almost without noticing, and it was nearly dinner time when the play ended. "Oh," Beauty sighed, "I have never enjoyed a play more. How wonderful to go to the theater whenever one wishes." That evening she told the Beast all about the play, quoting some of the amusing things the actors had said and making him roar with laughter. He laughed so loud that Cuthbert could hear the roaring and was frightened under the bed. Before he left, the Beast took out a little box and opened it. "To show you that I care," he said, and took out a ruby pendant, the great glowing red stone carved like a rose, and the leaves made up of emeralds and diamonds. As before, he placed the pendant around her neck and asked her to marry him. "No, Beast, I cannot," she replied gently, wishing he would not go on asking her and so bringing pain upon himself. But he accepted her refusal with a bow and left her. And that night she again dreamed of the beautiful woman who came and stood by her bedside in a shimmer of light. "Beauty, be brave and follow your heart. Do not be blinded by appearances, for they can deceive. If you listen to your heart, you will find true love." After the woman vanished into her dreams, the handsome young man appeared to her, and they walked in the gardens together. Again he sighed and told her that he was a prisoner, and only she could free him. "But I have searched, and I cannot find you," Beauty cried out, and the handsome young man looked even sadder. "Search in your heart, and I am there," he replied. And the sky grew dark, and he disappeared, leaving her alone and frightened. Running back to the palace, Beauty could hear the roaring of the Beast in the distance, and she wept as she ran for the young man who was her true love and was lost. For several days Beauty watched enraptured as plays, ballets, and operas unfolded before her in the little theater. Other doors opened onto a variety of scenes. One led to the deck of a ship, and she and Cuthbert could sit and feel the wind in their faces and taste the salt of the spray as the ship seemed to sail forever in a warm sea. Another showed her a fair with people passing to and fro, examining the bright wares and entertainment spread out in colorful booths. Though she longed to be free to join the happy crowd, Beauty was very well entertained as she watched the amusing scenes and odd characters that passed before her. So the days passed, and though she was lonely for her father and even for her sisters, Beauty was really quite contented in her enchanted palace. She had Cuthbert to play with by day, and the Beast to talk to in the evening. Occasionally the Beast would bring her a special present and ask her to marry him. She always said no, though she was sorry to hurt him. Beauty noticed that every time this happened, the beautiful woman and the handsome dream lover came to her in her dreams, promising that true love would be hers if only she could find it. But she knew she had searched everywhere in the palace, and he was not to be found. Gradually, after many such dreams, she grew heartsick with longing for her family, for her lover, for anyone human and real to talk to. One evening she was feeling especially sad. and so could not bring herself to laugh or sing or entertain the beast as he had become her habit. "Why so sad, Beauty?" "In truth, Beast, I am lonely for my family. I miss talking to my sisters and my father. I want to see them again." The beast looked at her for a long time in silence. Then he drew out a little box and showed her the necklace he had brought her. It was set with sapphires and diamonds in the shape of flowers, with emeralds to form the leaves. But Beauty took no pleasure in the sparkling flowers and leaves. "I want to go home, Beast, if only for a little. I am tired of being alone here all day and all night, except for when you come and talk to me. There is no one else here in the palace, is there?" She waited for his answer, for she knew in her heart that he would not lie to her. "No, there is no one else here." Her heart ached to hear it, for she was sure now that the dream lover was only a dream. He was not a prisoner in the palace, and she would never find him. Seeing the tears gathering in her great dark eyes, the beast sprang up. "Do not cry, Beauty. I cannot bear to see your tears, and I can refuse you nothing, even if it costs me my life. You shall go home." "Oh, dear beast," she cried, throwing her arms about his great neck. "Thank you with all my heart." Recalling herself, she drew back, blushing and a little afraid. "But you may stay for 1 month only, and if you do not come back when you promise, I will die because of it." She promised most faithfully to return at the end of a month, and the beast sighed. "Then you shall go. Here, take this ring." He drew a golden ring from his pocket and slipped it on her hand. "When you go to bed tonight, wish to be at home, and you will go there. When the month is over, do the same. Go to bed, wish to be here, and you will return. But do not fail me, Beauty, unless you wish to see me dead of a broken heart." She reassured him over and over that she would not fail, and at last he left her. Rushing back to her room, Beauty danced around, packing clothes and jewels to take to her sisters, books and gold for her father, and talking to Cuthbert the whole time. She gathered him close, for she had no intention of leaving him alone in the beast's palace. Closing her eyes, she wished with all her heart to go home. When Beauty opened her eyes, she was in a different room. The sun was shining in through the windows, and Cuthbert was still cuddled in her arms, purring contentedly. When she had dressed, she went out into the hall of what she perceived to be a large country house. And there was her father, weeping with joy at the sight of her and demanding to know how she had come there. She told him all about her life in the palace, about her horses and the park, and the wonderful room with the magic doors. Bella and Belinda were glad enough to see her, having thought that she was dead, but they were even more glad at the sight of the silk gowns and the jewels she had brought them. The beast's gold had purchased them a comfortable house and nice clothes in plenty, but they guessed it was nothing to compare with the riches of the beast's palace. As the days passed, the sisters grew jealous again, for they envied Beauty her beautiful palace and all the splendors it contained. They looked at the ruby rose pendant and the sapphire necklace and the pearls, and thought that nothing Beauty had given them compared with these gifts of the beast. Belinda, looking at the pendant, said, "Sister, that ruby will look so much better on me. Do give it to me, for surely the beast will give you another." Beauty was distressed and replied, "I would like to give you whatever you ask, sister, but though I will happily give you any of the other jewels, I cannot give you the things the beast gave me. It would surely hurt him dearly." And then Bella said, "Sister, those sapphires and emeralds were meant for a redhead, so do stop being selfish and give them to me." But Beauty shook her head and replied, "Any of the other jewels you may have and welcome, but the pendant and the necklace and the pearls were special gifts, and I cannot part with them." The sisters were bitterly angry at what they thought was Beauty's selfishness, and they determined to get even if they could find a way. One afternoon the sisters sat talking, and Belinda's eyes fell on the gold ring on Beauty's finger. "That is a plain little ring," she remarked. "I wonder that you care to wear it when your other jewels are so fine." "That is the ring I will use when I return to the beast's palace," she replied, "and that must be soon, for the month is almost over." Beauty's father cried out at that, insisting that Beauty must not return to that place ever again. Beauty explained that the beast had made her promise to return in a month, or he would die of a broken heart. Belinda and Bella looked at each other and nodded. If Beauty could not return to the palace, then the beast would die, and Beauty would no longer live in such a splendid manner when they were forced to make do with so much less. And so they pleaded with Beauty to stay just a little longer, and they were so sweet and charming to her that Beauty's heart was beguiled, and she stayed, telling herself that the month was not quite up, and she need not return just yet. The days passed, and Beauty was happy with her father and her sisters, and somehow she lost track of the exact number of days she had been at home. Finally, her heart had begun to nag at her a little, for she feared she had overstayed her time. Her father and her sisters pleaded and begged her to stay just a little longer, and at last she agreed to wait until the next night, but her heart was heavy. "Sister," said Belinda, "do let me see that curious little ring you wear." Beauty was reluctant to take the ring off, but her sisters pressed her, and finally she agreed and gave it to them. "Pooh! A poor little nothing!" exclaimed Bella, taking it in her hand. "You do not want such a trinket as this," she said, and with that she ran off with the ring. In that instant Beauty knew she had overstayed her visit, and the beast was dying. Beauty cried out at this, begging her sisters to give back the ring, saying, "I must have it to go back to the beast's palace. He is waiting for me, trusting me. Oh, please, sisters, give me back my ring." But though she begged and wept, they kept the ring away from her, and she knew that they would never give it back. At last, exhausted, she ran up the stairs to her room and threw herself on her bed in a storm of weeping. Just when she had given up all hope, she was startled out of her tears by the sound of Bella screaming in pain and rage. "He scratched me! He bit me! Oh, my hand is bleeding!" howled Bella from the stairs. "Catch him, you fool!" screamed Belinda. "He's got the ring!" But they were too late. Cuthbert, having pounced on Bella as she sat gloating over the ring, had bitten and scratched her so suddenly that she had dropped the ring, and he had seized it and run for his life. "Cuthbert!" exclaimed Beauty as he threw himself on her bed and dropped the ring on her pillow. In an instant she had it on her hand, and picking up the cat she wished with all her heart to be back in the beast's palace. She found herself in her luxurious room, the fire burning brightly, her nightgown laid out as usual. She hurried to the dining parlor, but though there was food laid ready, there was no sign of the beast. Running through the palace, she called for him, for her heart was filled with fear, but there was only silence. Cuthbert chased along behind her, mewing piteously, and at last he ran to the great doors and scratched. Beauty looked at the doors and remembered the beast's warning never to go outside the palace after dark. She remembered the terrible roaring she sometimes heard outside and shivered, but she knew that the beast was not going to come to her that evening, and that she had stayed at home for too long. Flinging open the great doors, she ran out into the night. Along every path, in every garden, she searched, calling for the beast, but he was nowhere to be found. At last she understood what the beautiful woman of her dreams had tried to tell her, but perhaps she understood it too late. Then she heard Cuthbert mewing from the lake. Running down the slope, she found the beast stretched on the ground under a willow, Cuthbert beside him, whining sadly. "Beast!" she cried, throwing herself down beside him and gathering his great head into her lap. "Oh, dear beast, speak to me!" For a long while the beast lay still as though dead. Tears fell down her cheeks onto the great face she had once thought so hideous. At last he opened his eyes and saw her. His voice was weak as he asked, "Why did you stay so long? Now I fear you have come back too late." "No, not too late, dear beast," she begged, "when I have finally discovered how much I love you." "Beauty, will you marry me?" "Yes, my dear, and I will love you every day of my life," she cried. With that the beast disappeared, and in his place was the handsome prince of her dreams. The beautiful woman was there too, more queenly than ever, for she was, in fact, a fairy queen and the prince's mother. "You have saved my son," she said in her sweet, silvery voice, "for he has been under the enchantment of an evil wizard, condemned to live as a beast until a girl whose inner grace was the equal of her outward beauty, who would love him in spite of his horrible appearance." "Beauty," said the prince, "you have set me free from a living death, because you recognized true love, though it wore the guise of a beast." And so Beauty and the prince were married, and the great palace was no longer silent and empty. They had a perfectly splendid wedding, and all the great and noble people of the land came to celebrate. Cuthbert had a diamond collar for the occasion, which he didn't much care for, and a number of chocolate mice, which he did. Beauty's father met a charming and comfortable woman of good nature and large fortune, and so he was loved and cared for the rest of his life. I would like to report that Belinda and Bella rejoiced in their sister's good fortune, but alas, they grew more jealous and resentful than ever, feeling it unfair that so much happiness had come to their sister. And because they only thought of themselves, their beauty faded, and they grew sharp and sour, and so disagreeable they couldn't even stand themselves. But Beauty and her prince filled their palace with love and laughter, and lived happily ever after.